Once I was an academic. Roman archaeology in the early years of Il Duce was still a pretty wild business. Down in Sicily it could get downright dangerous. I remember one time I left a little town in the Sicilian highlands in the middle of the night with a whole band of brigands on my tail. They may have been interested in a peculiar artifact I'd recovered from an obscure temple I was digging. They called the place Stygia and used to sacrifice a black dog at the new moon. They may also have sacrificed other things, but I didn't linger till the next month to find out. On the other hand, they may have been interested in what I'd been doing with a girl I'd gotten rather chummy with up there. Territorial types, the Sicilians. They called her the daughter of Stygia, as if it were a cult title. A pretty problem for an anthropologist, but it didn't interest me. I sold the artifact from the fane of Stygia to a private collector in Rome. Then, thinking that it would perhaps be wise to make my way a bit further north, the Sicilians still being on my mind, I joined an expedition going to do some work in the Alps. They were looking for clues to the mysterious disappearance of the Lost Legion, 21 rat packs. The head of the expedition, a German named Schwarzberg, thought he had a lead. Among other things, he had turned up a palimpsest of a manuscript by Tacitus. According to the manuscript, the winter of 95 was an unusually hard one, and it seems the emperor called Rapax out of its winter quarters on the Danube and ordered it to march up into the Alps and deal with a problem involving troublesome tribes. Rapax was in disgrace after supporting Saturninus' revolt in 89, so Domitian could yank them out of winter quarters and send them out on a hard slog if he wanted to, and do only good to the morale of the legions in general. That's what Schwarzberg told us, at any rate. Tacitus evidently gave some pretty telling hints at the exact location where the legion was destroyed, out on a glacier, and in so isolated a spot there was a reasonable hope of finding something. So off we went, a few weeks before midsummer. The spot turned out to be a dark, narrow valley, the glacier rather rotten and full of unpleasant dark blue crevasses. We started our work on the glacier, sending out test trenches to see what we could locate. The heat of the summer was helping, melting the snow day by day, and surprisingly quickly we located the remains of Rapax. It was quite near to the top of the valley, under no more than a couple of feet of ice. What we came on first was a thin vein of red, frozen in the ice. When we had dug down to that level and the stuff began to melt, we realized what it was. Big black flies settled on it in buzzing clouds, feasting on the millennia-old layer of gore. Continuing to dig, we came upon the source of the blood. There were no artifacts worth keeping except for a few coins in a pouch at his waist. The only evidence of cause of death was some damage to his skull. Oddly, it seemed that the soldier was killed by something that shot up through the top of his skull from the inside. At least, so Schwarzberg said. Forensics weren't my field. Moving toward the wall of the valley, we came on several more fellows, similarly disposed of. Eventually we got right up to the cliff, just, we discovered, as Rapax must have been before us. Digging our way down, we found the remains of fortifications in the ice. In the center of it was a thing like an igloo, a complete dome of ice blocks, all nicely shaped and well preserved. Even more peculiarly, Rapax had evidently expended much energy chipping flakes of stone off the sheer cliffs and using them to line the ground inside the fortifications. Excavating the area nearest to the dome, we found the evidence pointed not to mysterious causes of death, but to some kind of factional rivalry. Swords were drawn, the bodies draped in attitudes which suggested battle. A legion at full strength has 6,000 men in it. The remains of the soldiers were thickly piled, sometimes 3 and 4 deep. Strangely, we could find no entrance to the great ice dome that we assumed must have been some kind of command center. That night, the Swiss, Hans, was killed. There was no sound, and his tent mate, the South African, claimed he'd slept through the entire event. We found Hans's body in a way which hinted at some explanations while leaving yet more unexplained. He was outside the tent and frozen solid, which was rather perplexing since it was not terribly cold. There were scratch marks on his cheeks beside the nose, as if he'd pried at something wrapped around his face and across his mouth, muffling his screams. Moreover, an icicle had somehow been thrust entirely through his head, the tip protruding from the top of his skull, eerily recalling the injuries we found on several of the bodies of Roman soldiers. The South African and I were for immediate departure, but Schwarzberg wanted to use dynamite on that igloo and find out what was in it. He offered a bonus that was truly staggering. I grudgingly agreed to stay, thinking that only a few days, possibly only one, would be needed to earn the reward. That day we laid the dynamite and blew open the igloo. It was surprisingly thick. It turned out that a double layer of ice blocks had been laid, one within the other. What lay within was entirely different from what I'd expected. A hole and a spiral stair fell away to a dark blue depth, the bottom of which was invisible. Schwartzberg, however, seemed unsurprised. He and the Germans quickly arranged packs, provided themselves with lanterns, and prepared to descend. The South African and I were reluctant to accompany them. At last, Schwartzberg agreed to double the bonus he'd promised, and the South African acceded. I remained on the surface, and I shall never forget the nasty smile with which Schwartzberg said goodbye as the party descended into the enigmatic pit. I lay on my stomach, peering down into that awful pit and watching them descend as long as I could see them, circling around and around in an icy spiral. Night falls rapidly in a valley. Schwartzberg had threatened that unless I was there when they returned, he would ruin my reputation. Threats or no threats, I intended to cross the glacier and be on my way down the hill before dark, but gradually I whittled away the margin of safety, so when sun set on Midsummer Night's Eve, I was still there. That night, although I was quite alone, the memory of what happened to Hans drove away sleep. The hours crept slowly by, and I looked often at the little glowing hands on the radium dial of my watch. Cold seemed to worm its way into my bones. Added to this, there were ominous noises, creakings and crackings in the ice as things shifted deep below. Normal, I told myself. Such things are always happening on a glacier. A little past 11, I noticed a strange phenomenon. A cold light seemed to be rising from the gaping mouth of that unnatural shaft in the ice. At the same time, I thought I began to hear a faint sound, echoing up the tunnel as if from deep, deep below. Gradually, the light grew in strength. It flowed up out of the depths of that unholy pit, dancing and flickering with an unearthly radiance. I rose on my knees, intending to crawl to the edge, but fell back. An intimation of mind-blasting horror emanated from the gaping maw, and I knew that nothing on earth could make me look down into whatever foul and unnatural thing seethed and flowed far below. Instead I turned, staggering to my feet, determined to flee across the glacier although it was night. It was then that the sight which still haunts me struck my petrified eyes. The entire glacier was illumined from within with a light like that sickly radiance which rose from the horrid chasm behind me, and the glacier was not empty. Deep within, monstrous forms flowed and writhed, swimming through the frozen water. Their vile tentacles pulsed about them as they danced in the eons-old depths. I do not know how long I stood, frozen in fear. Then behind me I heard a sound. An evil flickering was spreading through the icy blood covering the stones in the fort. Here and there the ice seemed to be bunching into little spikes, rocking the bodies as if questing for something. I moved by instinct, hurling myself toward the rock wall of the valley. Something caught at my foot as I leapt at the wall, but it lost its purchase as I threw myself upward. I managed to wedge myself back into a shallow declivity. And there I remained, all that night until dawn. The dark shapes in the glacier danced their terrible dance, and the ice covering the stones cracked and twitched. At sunrise the next day, the movement in the ice ceased, and I fled, crossing the glacier and breathing a sigh of relief as the decreasing altitude brought warmer temperatures, and the secrets of the resting place of Rappax receded behind me. Over the years, I've gleaned terrible hints about the eons-old dweller beneath the ice, and the foul creatures which serve it. They rule the world of winter, the glacier, the ice floe, the white snowdrift. I choose to live, therefore, in a frost-free region, Los Angeles, a city blooming with roses and orange blossoms even in the middle of winter. Sometimes it can be a bit too warm. But for me, let the only chill in the air always be that of air conditioning.